about the fake information and false allegations on Kailasa, you fail to acknowledge the broader historical context in which Kailasa exists. The Hindu genocide and ethnocide that the Hindus have faced stand as one of the most tragic and overlooked chapters in the entire human history. We are indigenous people and we have suffered from colonization. At one given point in time, Hindus had over 56 indigenous nations, spanning approximately 6 million kilometers square across the entire Asian belt. With over 10,000 indigenous traditions, 1,700 provinces, and over 200 Hindu kingdoms. The dark chapter of several centuries includes massacre of over 500 million Hindus, slavery of 4 million Hindus, and artificially induced famines resulting in death of over 160 million Hindus, destruction of thousands of Hindu temples, over 1 million Hindu educational institutions, and over 80 million Hindu scriptures. Today, a very small fraction of these indigenous Hindu traditions endure, with the Hindu sovereign lands being unlawfully annexed, leading to the forced mass exodus of Hindus and the indigenous nations. Kailasa represents the revival and the preservation of these indigenous traditions, cultures, and knowledge systems that the colonizers attempted to eradicate. By delegitimizing Kailasa, El Mundo, you become a complicit in the ongoing erasure of the indigenous Hindu heritage. Let me attend to the next allegation that you pose. You say that Kailasa used deception and false promises to appropriate indigenous lands. This is categorically false. All the negotiations were conducted transparently with full disclosure and the presence of the community and the leaders of the community. The terms were clearly documented, translated into the local language, and explained in detail. The assertion that the indigenous leaders were somehow tricked is deeply patronizing and denies the intelligence and the agency of the indigenous people of Bolivia. Unlike colonial powers that have historically exploited the indigenous communities, Kailasa approached these agreements as partnership between sovereign entities with mutual benefits and responsibilities very clearly articulated in these agreements. El Mundo's reporting conspicuously ignores the political context in which these allegations against Kailasa have emerged. This is not journalism, but this is political theater. First, the timing of these accusations coincides with the internal politics and the tensions that is brewing in Bolivia, where various factions are competing for the influence over the indigenous communities and their resources. Kailasa has become a convenient scapegoat in this domestic political struggles. Second, El Mundo has failed to investigate the potential economic interest behind the opposition to Kailasa's conservation partnerships. There are powerful commercial entities, mining companies, agriculture corporations, extractive industries. They stand to benefit if the indigenous lands are open to commercial exploitation rather than protected through conservation agreements that Kailasa has entered into. The question that El Mundo should be asking, but isn't, is who benefits from undermining Kailasa's humanitarian partnership with these indigenous communities? Not the indigenous communities themselves, who would receive resources, support, international recognition through the agreements that Kailasa has signed. Not the environment, which would benefit from long-term conservation commitments of Kailasa. The beneficiaries are those who wish to exploit the indigenous peoples, the indigenous land for the resources of short-term profit. And this is the very colonial mindset that Kailasa stands against. You further go on to place an allegation that Kailasa offered financial incentives to commercialize indigenous heritage. The economic components of our agreements were not payments for land, but investments into the community for the development as stated earlier. These resources would be managed by the communities themselves according to their own priorities and structures. Kailasa's humanitarian aid is not gathered through taxes as most established nations would collect, but instead raised through the hard work and the sacrifices of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, Bhagavan Sri Nityananda Paramashiva, and the contributions of the hard-working individuals of a persecuted minority indigenous community that are inspired to do the same, witnessing the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's relentless sacrifices and the unshakable grit and commitment towards this mission. Kailasa is committed to the humanitarian contributions. However, it is very unfortunate that the anti-indigenous, Hindu-phobic, racist articles and media outlets such as El Mundo, such as you, have derailed these humanitarian services that Kailasa is committed to providing. Your publication, by hosting and publishing these articles, has extraordinarily amplified this systematic persecution. Instead of recognizing our contributions and our genuine commitment to the indigenous welfare, El Mundo, you have put a systematic and focused effort into inflicting deeply harmful disinformation that directly harms the vulnerable communities who are intended beneficiaries of Kailasa's humanitarian aid. You further go on to place allegation that indigenous communities demand Kailasa to be declared unwelcome. First of all, this entire allegation is entirely fabricated. Let us be absolutely clear. No legitimate indigenous communities have spoken anything against Kailasa. These supposed statements are completely fabricated and created by you and other media outlets to drive your anti-indigenous agenda. El Mundo, you have been deliberately gaslighting the indigenous people by manufacturing the false narratives that indigenous communities are acting against Kailasa. This is a classic divide and conquer tactic that is used throughout the entire colonial history, falsely claiming that indigenous people reject partnership that actually benefit them. What is actually happening is that the indigenous communities who formed legitimate diplomatic relations with Kailasa are being threatened and intimidated by the anti-indigenous media mafia. These communities face tremendous pressure when they exercise their constitutional rights to self-determination and international relations. The media fabricates opposition to delegitimize both the indigenous nations as well as Kailasa. El Mundo, your reportings are not only racial against Kailasa but violates the very rights of the indigenous people under both the Bolivian and the international law. Another allegation that El Mundo you place is that political controversy surrounding Kailasa's engagement with Bolivian officials. El Mundo implies impropriety in alleged engagement between Kailasa's representatives and including those close to President Luis Arce. This institution deliberately politicizes the legitimate diplomatic outreach, which is precisely how nations establish diplomatic relations throughout the world. What El Mundo maliciously frames as controversy is actually the standard diplomatic protocol that is followed by every sovereign nation around the world that is seeking to build international relations. The deliberate mischaracterization reveals El Mundo's true calculated attempt to undermine the legitimate diplomatic processes which involve the indigenous nations like Kailasa. Your reportings fail to acknowledge that the same indigenous communities have been historically pressured, manipulated, exploited by powerful economic and political interests within Bolivia. Yet, El Mundo shows absolutely no interest in investigating any of these systematic patterns of exploitation. Moreover, El Mundo completely ignores the defamatory treatment of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism in your reporting. In conclusion, we demand a sincere apology for the blatant inaccuracies that are represented in your articles and publication. A correction or clarification acknowledging the false information and providing the accurate details about Kailasa is imperative to rectify the harm that you have caused. More than 5 major corporate houses such as the Washington Post, MSN, The Week, Outlook Magazine, Dilamalar, and Sixth Italy have removed their Hindu-phobic and defamatory articles that carried similar disinformation against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and Kailasa. We expect El Mundo to follow suit and rectify the harm that you have caused through your irresponsible reporting. Your role as a responsible media entity obliges you to act in the public interest and uphold journalistic integrity. We anticipate your prompt cooperation in setting the record straight and in doing so, ceasing the perpetual continuation of the harmful narratives that are being spread by you against the indigenous community. We are open for further discussion and to provide additional information to facilitate accurate reporting. The question now is whether El Mundo will choose the path of journalistic integrity or continue to participate in the systematic persecution of the indigenous communities and the indigenous Hindu communities. The world is watching, the history will judge, truth will prevail. Thank you for your immediate attention to the matter. We expect a resolute and corrective response. Thank you, Nityanandam.
Nityanandam. Captain, this time. Your article titled "The Fictitious State Which Seeks to Occupy Indigenous Lands in Bolivia Caused the Fall of a Cabinet Chief in Paraguay" is a sloppy mix of snark, ignorance, and half-baked allegations, calling Kailasa a fictitious state with fake and real papers and colorful, showy attire, existing only in the mind of its creator and then on the run from justice. This isn't just an attack on Kailasa. It is a direct assault of the indigenous peoples of Bolivia who we proudly stand with. Your pretense of protecting indigenous interests while actively undermining indigenous sovereignty reveals the colonial mindset hiding behind your supposed journalism. Let's dismantle your nonsense with facts and hefty dose of reality. Now let's talk about your anti-indigenous position behind a veneer of concern. Here is the first glaring hypocrisy. While pretending to champion for indigenous rights, you are actively working to strip them away. The Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality in Article 30. By appointing yourself as a gatekeeper of which diplomatic relations indigenous communities may pursue, you are perpetuating the same racist colonial control mechanism you claim to oppose. It is like saying, we support indigenous autonomy as long as we approve all their decisions first. That's not advocacy, it's paternalism dressed up as concern. Now let's see about your systematic violation of journalistic ethics. You deliberately omitted crucial facts, including our agreements, legal compliance provisions, and the Supreme Pontiffs of Hinduism's legal exoneration in the United States. That's not an oversight, it is a racist, anti-indigenous, anti-Hindu, Hindu-phobic, and Hindu-mesic strategy. Number 2 is independence. Your reporting reeks of bias against indigenous communities and our right to self-determination. Who's pulling your strings? Fairness and impartiality. You presented a one-sided hit piece without taking Kailasa's perspective. Number 4, humanity. Your mockery of our traditional attire is straight-up Hindu-phobic cultural derision. Would you describe the Pope's vestments as showy attire or Arabi's garments as colorful clothing? Number 5 is accountability. When presented with contradictory evidence, you are doubled down rather than corrected. That's not journalism, that is propaganda. Now let's talk about your allegations, one flimsy claim at a time. Kailasa is a fictitious state, as you mentioned. Newsflash. Sovereignty isn't about fitting your outdated, map-obsessed worldview. You're a media outlet, not the United Nations. And by the way, even the United Nations itself declares it has no authority to recognize a state. That's right. By the United Nations' own admission, recognition is a political act, not a legal prerequisite. Your reporting contains a glaring logical contradictions. You call Kailasa fictitious while simultaneously reporting on diplomatic activities and international impact. If we are imaginary, then how did we establish relations that led to a cabinet chief resignation in Paraguay? How have we signed agreements with indigenous communities? Your own reporting defeats your argument. Kailasa actually fulfills all criteria established in the 1933 Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of the State, which are permanent population, defined territory, government, capacity for international relations. And Kailasa fulfills all of these 4 characteristics. The Montevideo Convention explicitly states that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. Just a quick question. Are Taiwan, Kosovo, or Palestine as states? Some say yes and others say no. But the right to self-determination doesn't hinge on unanimous consensus. It is enshrined in international law. Now you claim with the fake and real papers and colorful showy attire. Oh, you went there, attacking our paperwork and our wardrobe? Bold move for a serious outlet. First, Kailasa documents are the legitimate as any nations recognized in diplomatic circles and backed by the will of its people. Sovereignty isn't bureaucracy contest, it's about identity and governance, which we've got covered. As for the colorful and showy attire, that's not a costume, it's culture. Our attire represents thousands of years of Hindu tradition and is protected under Bolivia's own constitution of Article 21, Clause number 3, that enshrines the right to freedom of thought, spirituality, religion, and worship. Your mockery isn't just pity, it violates Bolivia's law number 045 against religious discrimination. Would you dare to describe the traditional clothing of any other religious or cultural group in such a derogatory terms? This isn't reporting, it's a colonial-era racist, anti-indigenous, Hindu-mistic and Hindu-phobic propaganda with a modern byline. Now addressing your statement that country exists only in the mind of its creator, a man on the run from justice. Exists only in the mind? Tell that to the millions of followers and temples we have built, and the 2 billion free meals we have served to people, and the global humanitarian impact Kailasa has made. It's not a daydream, it's a movement. As for a man on the run from justice, nice try. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, Bhagwan Sri Nityananda Paramashivam, is not fleeing anything. He is being completely exonerated by the United States Federal Court, which ruled in his favor and fined the false accusers nearly $500,000 in a district court of Southern District of Ohio. Additionally, on February 2nd, 2024, the Gujarat High Court exonerated the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism of all charges of abduction and kidnapping. The SPH was not even in Gujarat at the time. Despite nearly 15 years of malicious persecution in India, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has never been convicted of any crime, and Interpol has rejected all requests to issue notice against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. 11 medical reports from Ohio, California, Michigan, Canada, and India have confirmed the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's inherent medical condition renders him physically incapable of committing the alleged crimes. The persecution against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism follows a documented pattern. A deepfake video was released in March 2010 to incite hatred. False legal accusations followed the media campaign. The High Court of Karnataka explicitly observed the undue media influence against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. Then after 53 days of investigation, police found no evidence to establish claims against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. Multiple international human rights experts have confirmed that the prosecution has developed into persecution, including former United Nations Justice Council jurist Jeffrey Robertson. Your failure to report these established legal facts demonstrates malicious intent, not journalism. Now let's address your statement calling the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism a self-proclaimed guru. Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism lineage traces back at least 12,000 years through Hinduism's oldest spiritual institutions, which has been clearly documented. He is recognized, revered, and worshipped as the incarnation of Paramashiva as per Hinduism, with more than 1 million letters of commendation and recognition from country statesmen, religious pontiffs, and noteworthy personalities across the entire globe. Now, calling him self-proclaimed is like saying Pope's just a guy in a fancy hat, or Dalai Lama is a meditation hobbyist. It's not just wrong, it is laughably out of touch and violates Bolivia's constitution, Article 30, which specifically protects indigenous peoples' cultural identity and religious beliefs. Now let's address your false claim saying that Kailasa tried to establish perpetual rental of indigenous lands. What right do you have as a media house, and that also fake, anti-indigenous, Hindu-phobic, Hindu-mistic and colonial media outlet to interfere in agreements signed between sovereign indigenous nations, which was, by the way, signed completely legally as per the Bolivian constitution and international law. Every agreement we've established with indigenous communities contains an explicit provision ensuring compliance with Bolivian law. Quote, payment effectuated after ratification by competent authorities, ensuring full compliance with Bolivian law number 465 and ILO Convention 169. This crucial safeguard, which you deliberately omitted from your reporting, demonstrates our absolute commitment to legal compliance. These were the conservation partnership, not territorial acquisition efforts. They have been endorsed by indigenous leaders who retain full sovereignty under Bolivia's constitution. These indigenous communities maintain complete control over their lands and territories within these partnerships. The time frame reflects the long-term commitment needed for effective environmental stewardship, not an attempt to control land. Long-term conservation agreements are standard practice globally. It's telling that media outlets like yours call 99-year leases by corporate interest investments by labeling cooperative agreements between indigenous nations as violation of rights. This double standard exposes your true agenda, Vision 360. Now let's address your false claim saying that Kailasa is supposedly located on an island in the Pacific Ocean. Where have we claimed this? We have never claimed this. These are the false rumors perpetuated by lazy, fake media outlets like yours. Kailasa has never claimed ownership of any island of Ecuador coast. This clarification was published on Kailasa's official website on March 17, 2023, predating your false reporting. And we have already disclosed many of our sovereign territories of Kailasa, which can be actually found on our website at kailasa.org. Why don't you do some actual research before publishing your fake, anti-indigenous, racist articles? Now your abusive statement, which included saying that Kailasa have 2 billion inhabitants. Your mockery claim, what is known about Kailasa, that it would have more than 2 billion of inhabitants. Let's clarify. Statistically, there are 2 billion born and practicing Hindus worldwide. And Kailasa is the first and only sovereign indigenous Hindu nation representing their rights and interests. Our goal is serving these 2 billion Hindus' spiritual needs and improving the global quality of life. Through racist, anti-Hindu, anti-indigenous Hindu music articles like yours, you further persecute an already marginalized indigenous community for which there could be serious consequences. Then you go on saying that anyone can be part of Kailasa and become a citizen of Kailasa if they just make some donation. Where have we stated this, first of all? We have never claimed this. In fact, our e-citizenship is free service designed to serve 2 billion born and practicing Hindus. Anyone can register at ecitizen.info, including you, without any donation required. This is yet another fabrication by your anti-Hindu, anti-indigenous, racist, fake media machine. Now let's move on to your claim that Kailasa activities have caused problems in several countries. Who said that? This is racist, anti-indigenous media outlets like yours making these claims. Where is your evidence? Over 100 corporate large media houses from more than 14 countries, including the Washington Post, the CBC, MSN, Italy 24 and others, have already removed their Hindu-phobic publication against Kailasa after realizing they were spreading misinformation. Now we'll tell you the real story. Kailasa has extended humanitarian grants to over 100 indigenous nations, supported environmental sustainability and forest conservations, provided education, healthcare, and food security programs, served over 2 billion free meals to people in need globally. During our recent Mahakumbh Mela Peace Conclave organized by Kailasa, we fed over 30,000 people daily. Now let's zoom out for a second. This isn't just a bad reporting, it's a colonial hangover. By trashing Kailasas as fictitious, you are spitting on an indigenous Hindu nation fighting to rise from centuries of persecution. 500 million Hindus were massacred, more than 4 million enslaved, more than 160 million killed and induced into man-made, fabricated famines. Thousands of temples and over 1 million educational institutions and 80 million scriptures were destroyed. Kailasa represents the revival of these indigenous traditions that colonizers attempted to eradicate. Your snark isn't clever. It's complicitly an ongoing cultural erasure and genocide. Now let's address some of the legal violations in your reporting. Your hit piece is not just sloppy, it is legal mess. And here now we'll see what you have violated. You have violated Bolivia's own constitution, Article 4, 21 and 30, Article 98 and 403. You have violated the Law 045 against racism and all forms of discrimination. You have violated Law number 73, recognizing indigenous jurisdictional authority. You have violated Law number 1257, ratifying ILO Convention 169. You have violated international instruments including the American Convention on Human Rights, ICCPR, and UNDRIP. This isn't journalism, it's liability. Better lawyer up. Now conclusion. 6 major outlets, the Washington Post, the MSN, the Week, Outlook, Dinamalar, Italy 24 and many others already backtracked after they called out the anti-Hindu racist propaganda. Now you are on the deck. We demand you publish our response in full, ensure an immediate retraction of these false claims, and commit to fair, accurate reporting on indigenous issues. We have all the legal facts and documents to prove our statements. And what legal documents and proofs do you have for your allegations? Anti-indigenous, anti-Hindu, racist media is spreading misinformation against a persecuted indigenous communities. The people of Bolivia deserve better than this racist disinformation campaign. The world is watching. The truth is unflinching. And we are not budging. Nityananda.
Nityanandam, dear opinion, I am speaking on behalf of the United States of Kailasa about your article from March 21, 2025. We have read it and frankly, it's left us shocked. Your piece isn't just inaccurate, it's a deliberate attack on our sovereign nation and the indigenous Hindu communities we represent. We are here to correct the record with facts and not fictions. Let's start with this. Your article calls Kailasa an alleged nation and questions our existence. But by what authority you decide what's a state? The Montevideo Convention of 1933, Article 3 says clearly the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. That's international law, not an opinion. Even the United Nations doesn't recognize states, it admits members. So why are you making rules that don't exist? You seem to pick and choose who gets to be a state. Would you call Taiwan an alleged nation? What about Kosovo or Palestine? The Sovereign Order of Malta has no territory but has diplomatic ties with 112 countries and United Nations observer status as per the United Nations Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations Preamble. The Tibetan government in exile has been around since 1959. Was Poland fictional when it was occupied by World War II? No. So why single out Kailasa? It feels like this skepticism only applies to us because we are Hindus. And denying the indigenous right to us, indigenous nations, is the worst form of colonization. You claim to support indigenous rights, but then questions Bolivia's indigenous nations for partnering with us. Bolivian Constitution, Article 30, Section 2 guarantees their right to self-determination. They have chosen to work with Kailasa freely, yet you act like they need saving from their own decisions. That's not support, it's denying their sovereignty. Our agreements with them say payment effectuated after ratification by competent authorities, respecting Bolivian law fully. Next, let's talk ethics. You ignored the facts like the United States Court exonerating the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism or the legal basis for our statehood in the Montevideo Convention Article 1. Your bias against Hindu communities is clear. Why else target us like this? How is this fair? Did you ask us for a comment? No. One-sided stories are not journalism. Calling us fictional hurts millions who see Kailasa as their home. That's not just an attack on us, it's personal. Over 40 media outlets like Washington Post, MSN have corrected their mistakes. What's stopping you? Let me share a bit of history you missed. You act as if Kailasa popped up overnight, but our roots go deep. The Hindu civilization faced a genocide, 500 million killed, 4 million enslaved, 160 starved. All of this has been systematically recorded in history. Today, Hinduism lacks recognition in over 66 countries, while others recognize Islam or Christianity officially. Kailasa exists to protect this ancient culture. The Tondai Mandala Sannidhanam, government in exile, started in 1947 after India's partition, not just last week. The supreme pontiff of Hinduism, Bhagavan Shri Nityananda Paramashivam, continues the lineage as the 203rd sovereign emperor of the Surya Vamsha. That's not fantasy, that's history. We are not making this up. International law backs us. The Vienna Convention on Succession of States 1978 says a state's identity doesn't vanish with upheaval. Our lineage proves this. The Permanent Court of Justice 1923 ruled, private rights acquired under existing law does not cease on a change of sovereignty. Our rights stand. Montevideo Convention Article 3 confirms states exist without needing recognition, and we meet all criteria for this: population, territory, government, and the ability to enter into diplomatic relations. You say our agreements let us control airspace, legal systems, and taxes in indigenous territories. That's nonsense. Our treaties are notarized under Bolivian law with clauses ensuring compliance, like payment effectuated after ratification. These are partnerships for education, conservation, and culture, not takeovers. Why are you twisting the truth? Over 40 media outlets from 14 countries like MSN, The Week, and Italy 24 have retracted similar false claims and apologized. They chose truth. Your article has caused real harm. Over 100,000 documented cases of damage. If your journalists, not propagandists, retract this, correct it, and say sorry. If not, we'll see you in court, where facts matter more than opinions. Kailasa will keep going, with or without your approval. The truth doesn't need your permission, and our sovereignty does not need your stamp. 6 media houses have already backed off and unpublished their propaganda after seeing the law and ethics. You can join them or be a lesson in what not to do. So, opinion, will you fix this? The choice is yours, and the world's watching. Nityanandam.
Nityanandam. To all media representatives and global citizens watching today, I stand before you today as the voice of countless indigenous communities worldwide who have endured centuries of systematic erasure, persecution, and exploitation, all perpetuated under the thin veneer of protection by the very institutions claiming to advocate for them. The recent publication by Observatorio de Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, ODPIB, falsely branding Kailasa as a fictitious nation, represents the latest chapter in an ongoing campaign of delegitimization that indigenous communities have faced for generations. Make no mistake, this is not just an attack on Kailasa. This is an attack on the fundamental right to self-determination that belongs to every indigenous people on this planet. Let me speak plainly. While ODPIB postures as a defender of indigenous rights, their actions betray their true agenda to strip indigenous communities of their sovereignty, their resources, and their voice. This breathtaking hypocrisy cannot and will not stand unchallenged. Today, I will dismantle ODPIB's false narrative piece by piece, exposing not just the journalistic malpractice, but the dangerous colonial mindset that underpins their entire campaign.
First, let us address ODPIB's complete abandonment of fundamental journalistic ethics. They deliberately omitted crucial facts about Kailasa's legitimate diplomatic relations and international standing, a textbook case of misinformation by omission. They published defamatory claims without even the basic courtesy of contacting us for comment or verification, violating the most elementary principle of balanced reporting. They displayed unmistakable bias against indigenous communities, revealing a troubling double standard in how different indigenous communities are treated. They consistently failed to correct demonstrable inaccuracies when presented with contradictory evidence, showing contempt not just for us but for their own readers. To the editors at ODPIB, I ask directly, how do you reconcile claiming to defend indigenous rights while systematically denying indigenous rights to speak for themselves? How do you justify appointing yourselves as the arbiters of which indigenous voices deserve recognition? By what authority do you declare certain indigenous nations fictitious while elevating others? The most disturbing aspect of ODPIB's reporting is not its factual inaccuracies, though there are numerous, but its underlying agenda. Let us call it as it is. Let us call it what it is: neo-colonialism disguised as advocacy. While claiming to defend indigenous communities, ODPIB is actively working to delegitimize the right of indigenous nations to engage in sovereign diplomatic relations. This is not protection, it is paternalism. It is not advocacy, it is appropriation of indigenous voices. Article 32(4) of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous peoples the right to self-determination and territoriality. Article 32(5) ensures their right to maintain their own institutions. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Bolivia proudly ratified through Law number 3760 in 2007, affirms in Article 3 that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. ODPIB is not an authority to recognize nations. This fact bears repeating. ODPIB is a media house, not a diplomatic body. Even the United Nations itself, by its own declaration, lacks the authority to recognize states. It can only admit members. Recognition is a political act, not a legal prerequisite for statehood. Kailasa meets every internationally recognized criterion for statehood under the Montevideo Convention. A permanent population of devoted citizens unified by a common cultural and spiritual heritage. A defined territory with historical continuity stretching back thousands of years. A functional government with established institutions of justice, education, social welfare. The demonstrated capacity for international relations, as evidenced by our numerous diplomatic agreements. The Montevideo Convention itself establishes that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. This is not our opinion. This is settled international law. Furthermore, Kailasa's judicial statehood is derived from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's inheritance of 21 ancient indigenous sovereign states and ecclesiastical institutions, including the Suryavamsa Surangi Samrajya. The doctrine of continuity in international law recognizes a state's persistent legal personality through periods of annexation or occupation, as seen with Poland, Ethiopia, Austria after World War II. By dismissing Kailasa as fictitious, ODPIB reveals not just journalistic negligence, but a fundamentally colonial mindset, one that only recognizes indigenous sovereignty when it aligns with Western colonial power structures. Denying the indigenous right to us indigenous nations is the worst form of colonizing. Our second point addresses ODPIB's baseless claim that our agreements with Bolivian indigenous communities were somehow fraudulent or deceptive. Let me be absolutely clear. Every treaty between Kailasa and indigenous communities in Bolivia was executed with meticulous attention to legal compliance, full transparency, and genuine informed consent. These agreements include a comprehensive prior and informed consent documentation signed by legitimate indigenous leaders, explicit acknowledgement of Bolivian sovereignty and legal frameworks, specific clauses ensuring that all relevant authorities are informed. There is clear language stating payment effectuated after ratification by competent authorities, provisions for cultural exchange, knowledge preservation, and sustainable development. These provisions ensure full compliance with Bolivian law number 465, ILO Convention 169, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These are not exploitative arrangements. They are conservation partnerships endorsed by indigenous leaders who retain their sovereignty under Bolivia's constitution. Article 403 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly recognizes the ancestral territories of indigenous nations and their right to govern them in accordance with their own norms, procedures, and institutions. The agreement with Kailasa falls squarely within these protected rights. To label these agreements as fraudulent is to not only disrespect Kailasa, but to infantilize and dismiss the legitimate decision-making authority of Bolivia's indigenous communities. Is ODPIB suggesting that indigenous leaders are incapable of entering into agreements without outside approval? This patronizing attitude reveals more about ODPIB's view of indigenous people than it does about these agreements. ODPIB's accusation that Kailasa engages in carbon piracy is not just false, it is an appalling inversion of reality that borders on the absurd. The environmental record for Kailasa speaks for itself. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has personally led the revival of ancient Vedic agricultural techniques that predate modern sustainable practices by thousands of years. Techniques that have maintained the fertility of soil for millennia without chemical inputs. Kailasa has directly participated in the planting of millions of trees worldwide through our spiritual missions and environmental initiatives. Tangible carbon sequestration that can be verified by independent observers. We have established water conservation systems based on ancient Hindu science that have transformed arid regions into productive agricultural zones without depleting groundwater resources. Our communities worldwide practice vegetarianism at rates exceeding 95%, dramatically reducing our carbon footprint compared to the global average and demonstrating our commitment to ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings. If ODPIB is genuinely concerned about environmental exploitation in Bolivia, I invite them, I challenge them to redirect their investigative resources toward the multinational mining corporations extracting lithium, silver, zinc, and tin from indigenous territories while leaving toxic waste that will poison the land for generations. The petroleum companies drilling on ancestral lands with minimal compensation to indigenous communities. The agribusiness conglomerates converting pristine rainforest into cattle ranches and monoculture plantations. The international financial institutions imposing extractive economic policies that prioritize resource exploitation over indigenous well-being. This is the stark reality of ODPIB's double standard. When actual colonizers extract resources while devastating ecosystems, you call it investment and development. When indigenous communities collaborate on conservation, you call it carbon piracy and fraud. This is not journalism. This is propaganda serving powerful economic interests that benefit from keeping indigenous communities divided, disempowered, and dependent. ODPIB falsely claims our agreements aim to commodify the environment and natural resources. The truth is not merely different, it is diametrically opposed to their accusation. Kailasa has established itself as a global leader in authentic, sustainable development. Kailasa was a key contributor at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Kailasa was a key contributor at the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Geneva in February 2023, where our delegation presented ancient indigenous policies aligned with sustainable development principles that predate Western concepts of environmentalism by centuries. Kailasa hosted a groundbreaking global awareness session during the 79th United Nations General Assembly Science Summit in September 2024, bringing together scientists, indigenous knowledge keepers to develop integrated approaches to climate challenges. We continually advocate for the integration of indigenous wisdom with modern scientific frameworks, promoting sustainability, gender equality, and environmental conservation at the highest levels of international discourse. Our initiatives include free education for thousands of children worldwide, healthcare systems that integrate ancient and modern approaches, and sustainable agricultural practices that enhance rather than deplete natural resources, all rooted in indigenous traditions that have stood the test of time. Beyond their journalistic malpractice, ODPIB's defamatory claims constitute clear violations of Bolivian law. Law number 45 against racism and all forms of discrimination explicitly prohibits discrimination, defamation against indigenous communities. Article 16 states in unambiguous terms, any form of racist or discriminatory behavior expressed through written, printed, electronic or any other means that humiliates, insults or discredits another person or group of persons based on their belonging to an indigenous nation will be sanctioned. Furthermore, Article 281 of the Bolivian Penal Code, modified under Law 45, criminalizes public defamation and discrimination with enhanced penalties when such actions target indigenous communities. By falsely claiming that Kailasa is fraudulent, ODPIC is setting a dangerous legal precedent, one that threatens the legitimacy of all indigenous treaties and emboldens those who wish to exploit and disenfranchise indigenous nations. Who benefits from such narratives? Certainly not the indigenous communities who ODPIB claims to defend. The beneficiaries are the same extractive industries and neo-colonial powers that have systematically plundered indigenous resources for centuries. On behalf of all the indigenous communities, I hereby issue the following formal demands to ODPIB. Issue an immediate and comprehensive public retraction of all false and defamatory claims against Kailasa and its agreements with Bolivian indigenous communities, to be published with the same prominence as the original defamatory content. Cease and desist from publishing any further misinformation regarding Kailasa or its legal engagements with indigenous nations worldwide. Publicly acknowledge the sovereign rights of indigenous nations to enter into lawful agreements without external interference or paternalistic oversight. Implement proper journalistic training for your staff on ethical reporting standards, particularly regarding indigenous rights and sovereignty. As we close this response, let me remind you that more than 40 major international media houses from 14 countries, including major organizations like the Washington Post, have already recognized their error in publishing similar disinformation and have removed such defamatory content and issued apologies after recognizing their errors. They chose journalistic integrity over perpetuating falsehoods. What will you choose? I conclude with this unequivocal statement. What ODPIB has done is not merely unethical journalism. It is a calculated attack on indigenous sovereignty that perpetuates centuries of colonial oppression. We see through these tactics. The world sees through them, and we will not be silenced. Kailasa stands today as it has always stood, as a beacon of indigenous resilience, spiritual wisdom, and cultural preservation. The misinformation campaign led by ODPIB will not deter us from our sacred mission to protect indigenous rights and wisdom for future generations. We call upon the global indigenous rights community, international human rights organization, and all people of conscience to recognize and condemn this attack on indigenous sovereignty. Make no mistake, we will defend the rights of all indigenous peoples with every tool at our disposal. Nityanandam.
Nityanandam. This is Kailasa's official response to Ahora el Pueblo. I address you on behalf of Kailasa regarding your recent articles that systematically misrepresent our sovereign nation, our diplomatic efforts, and our humanitarian mission, while simultaneously undermining the sovereignty of indigenous nations in Bolivia. For a publication named Ahora el Pueblo, your reporting demonstrates a concerning lack of interest in the actual communities affected by your words. The irony isn't lost on us that a media outlet serving the local people seems so determined to conjure entire populations out of existence through journalistic sleight of hand. You've declared Kailasa a fictional nation, with the confidence of a child insisting their imaginary friend deserves a seat at the dinner table. How fascinating that you've devoted an entire article to something you claim doesn't exist. That's quite a word count for a hallucination, isn't it? Kailasa isn't a recent invention. It is the revival of ancient Hindu sovereign states and ecclesiastical institutions with documented unbroken succession spanning thousands of years. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is the 203rd sovereign in a lineage with historical roots that were flourishing while many recognized nations were still figuring out the wheel. The Montevideo Convention of 1933 explicitly states that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. This isn't just our opinion, it's binding international law. Your apparent belief that nations spring into existence only when blessed by former colonial powers is not just wrong, it's just ridiculously outdated. So ask yourself, would you describe Taiwan as fictional? Kosovo, Palestine? The Sovereign Order of Malta maintains diplomatic relations with 112 countries, despite having no territory. Are they fictional too? You claim Kailasa is not recognized as a state by any actor in the international community within the framework of the 1961 Vienna Convention. This statement reveals a legal understanding so profoundly confused, it would make first-year law students wince in sympathetic embarrassment. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations doesn't establish criteria for statehood. It codifies diplomatic privileges and immunities. Citing as a basis of state recognition is like using a cookbook to diagnose a medical condition. You're holding the wrong manual entirely. Kailasa fulfills all four criteria of statehood established in the Montevideo Convention with flying colors. We have a permanent population. We maintain a defined territory. We have an established government, and we clearly demonstrate capacity for international relations. while claiming to merely report government statements, your articles actively undermine indigenous rights with the precision of a colonial administrator dividing territories on a map. By framing Kailasa as fictitious or alleged, you delegitimize not only our nation, but also the indigenous communities who have exercised their constitutional right to enter into international partnerships. Bolivia's plurinational constitution explicitly recognizes indigenous self-governance as a fundamental principle of the state, a document that you seem to have skimmed with the attention span of a goldfish. Article 30, Section 2.4 guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality, while Article 30, Section 2.5 ensures their right to maintain their own institutions. It appears that your concern for indigenous rights evaporates faster than morning dew when indigenous communities exercise those rights in ways that don't fit your preconceived notions. Thus, this selective application of principles is as transparent as your attempts at serious journalism. Your failure to include perspectives from indigenous leaders whose sovereignty you so casually dismiss speaks volumes, and none of those volumes would make for flattering reading. Your dismissive "the origins are Hindu" comment speaks volumes about your publication's biases. Would you summarize the Vatican as its origins are Catholic and consider your journalistic duty fulfilled? Or is it reductionism reserved for traditions that don't originate from your preferred hemisphere? This isn't just a sloppy journalism, this is cultural erasure dressed up as reporting and accessorized with prejudice. You've chosen to repeat tired falsehoods about the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism with all the investigative rigor of a gossip column, while conveniently omitting his complete exoneration by the United States Federal Court, which ruled in his favor and fined the false accusers nearly $500,000. See United States District Court of Southern District of Ohio, case number 2, 13-CV-00526. Despite nearly 15 years of malicious prosecution in India, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has never been convicted of any crime. A fact you might have discovered had you engaged in that quaint journalistic practice known as research. 11 medical experts have confirmed his physical condition makes him incapable of committing the alleged crimes. Multiple international human rights experts, including former UN Justice Council jurist Jeffrey Robertson, KC, have confirmed that the prosecution has devolved into persecution. Your silence on these established legal facts speaks louder than your accusations ever could. It's practically shouting through a megaphone. You've characterized legitimate diplomatic agreements between sovereign entities as suspicious, with all the nuances of a medieval witch hunt. All our agreements with indigenous nations include the explicit provisions, payment effectuated after ratification by competent authorities, thus ensuring full compliance with Bolivian law number 465 and ILO Convention 169. The implication that indigenous leaders lack the capacity to enter into international agreements isn't just an insult to Kailasa, it's a patronizing dismissal worthy of a 19th century colonial administrator. These agreements focus on preserving indigenous cultural heritage, not exactly villainous. Protecting biodiversity in ancestral territories, scandalous. Supporting sustainable development initiatives, how dare we? And documenting and preserving endangered knowledge systems. The horror. The time frame reflects the long-term commitment needed for effective environmental stewardship, not some nefarious global conspiracy. Long-term conservation agreements are standard practice globally, recognized by international environmental law, and only suspicious to those whose historical understanding stop at yesterday. Your claim that Kailasa managed to sneak into United Nations sessions deserves a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. What's next? We use an invisibility cloak and magic password. Kailasa
indigenous peoples themselves, denying the indigenous right to us. Indigenous nations is the worst form of colonizing. Your entire narrative focuses on delegitimizing the constitutional right of indigenous nations to engage in diplomatic relations, a right explicitly protected under international law, including Article 3 of the UNDRIP, which guarantees the indigenous people's right to self-determination. It is profoundly hypocritical that Times Now, as part of the anti-Hindu deep state nexus, positions itself as a defender of indigenous rights while simultaneously undermining the fundamental right of indigenous communities to enter into agreements with international partners of their choice. This anti-indigenous position reveals your true agenda as colonial mafia, not protecting the indigenous communities but rather perpetuating colonial control mechanisms that deny indigenous nations their rightful place in the international community. Times Now, the world's most corrupt media today, has failed to meet any of the internationally recognized standards of ethical journalism. You liars have deliberately omitted crucial facts regarding Kailasa's legitimate diplomatic relations, international standing, and the legal exoneration of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism in multiple courts. This selective reporting constitutes misinformation by omission. Your reporting demonstrates clear bias against indigenous Hindu communities and our right to self-determination, suggesting external influence from the anti-Hindu deep state in your editorial decisions. You frauds have presented a severely distorted perspective, deliberately excluding Kailasa's position and evidence that contradicts your narrative. Your dehumanizing language referring to a sovereign nation as fictitious demonstrates a concerning lack of respect for the dignity and self-determination of indigenous Hindu communities. Your failure to correct inaccuracies when presented with contradictory evidence demonstrates a disturbing lack of accountability to your viewers. It actually speaks volumes that Times Now media mafia released the defamatory broadcast without contacting us for comment or verification. Your failure to seek our perspective before broadcasting demonstrates what only can be interpreted as a deliberate intent to misrepresent Kailasa and incite further persecution against our already marginalized community. The allegation 1 that Times Now says the most bizarre and audacious scam of the decade, the global land scam that has shocked the entire world. This inflammatory characterization by you deep state goons is categorically false and constitutes defamation as per all international law. The legitimate diplomatic relations and agreements between Kailasa and several of the indigenous nations. Many times you guys think that we have diplomatic relations. Kailasa actually has diplomatic relations with only few indigenous nations in Bolivia. I want to correct that statement that Kailasa's policy is actually not just revealing all the diplomatic relations, but all of you should know that Kailasa has signed with over 100 indigenous nations across the globe. But of course, because you're too busy in trying to spin such lies and such disgusting defamation, you don't even know the beautiful work that Kailasa is doing all over the world. Kailasa's agreements between Kailasa and the indigenous nations are legitimate diplomatic agreements exercising constitutional rights to self-determination and scams or cons in any sense. You liars are deliberately using emotionally charged language like shocking, bizarre, jaw-dropping, absurd to just inflame, which is actually nothing and completely constitutional and as per the international law. This sensationalist framing reveals Times Now's intent to defame rather than report, manufacturing outrage where legitimate diplomatic relations actually exist. I dare you, go and ask our indigenous brothers and sisters of Bolivia. Go and ask the actual presidents and the community leaders of the indigenous people. Ask them what Kailasa has done to them and ask them today what our relationship and what their relationship is with Kailasa. You will get an overwhelming positive response and gratitude from those indigenous leaders for how much Kailasa has done and how much that you, anti-indigenous media, are stopping Kailasa from coming and protecting their lands, from coming and providing our aid to their people, from providing the best that we can from the indigenous Hindu nation to the people of the Amazonian Bolivian region. The Bolivian constitution, of course, gives so much of protection and rights for the indigenous people. Your attack, your defamation, you might think that you're attacking Kailasa, but in fact, you're actually attacking the constitution of the plurinational state of Bolivia. Article 30 of the Bolivian constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality. Article 30 continues that it ensures their right to maintain their own institutions, and Article 403 states that the integrity of indigenous territory is recognized, which includes the right to maintain and develop their own forms of economic, cultural, and spiritual life. The indigenous communities' diplomatic relations with Kailasa are protected by these constitutional provisions given by the plurinational state of Bolivia. Yet times now colonial mafia deliberately omits this crucial legal context. I actually want to ask the Times Now media that you do not even know Bolivian law. You do not even know. Why do you even care about what happens between our Kailasas, United States organizations, and the Bolivian government? I'm actually trying to see why you are so involved, why you're so outraged, as if it's your land, as if it's your home. This is between Kailasa, our legal entities in the United States, and the plurinational state of Bolivia, and the indigenous communities in Bolivia, and does not concern the Times Now jurisdiction or even anywhere close to the Republic of India where you are currently. Actually, this brings a huge doubt. Why are you even bothered? Aren't you an Indian media house? Is this happening in India? It gives so much of concern that somebody else is behind you giving so much of these news articles and you giving so much of attention to something that's happening 2,000, 5,000 miles away. Not just the Constitution of Bolivia, but the Constitution of Bolivia is a signatory to various international law, including the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. The Article 36 specifically ensures that indigenous people have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation with their own members as well as people across borders. This statement actually brings a very clear statement that it is not just the national, internationally, the indigenous people are allowed as per the international law, as per the international conventions, which even Bolivia is a signatory of. All of these give the right for Kailasa as the indigenous Hindu nation to establish diplomatic relations with our brothers and sisters of the indigenous people of Bolivia. And again, it really does not concern, are we even near your jurisdiction? Are we even near the places where you operate, which is the Republic of India and Southern Asia? It brings a huge doubt of why you are so uninterested. Who is behind you? Who is actually driving the narrative that you are trying to expose here? By characterizing the legitimate indigenous diplomatic relations as a scam, Times Now, you anti-indigenous media mafia directly undermine all of these international law and all of these law that make up and which the plurinational state of Bolivia is a signatory of. And I also want to tell one thing really clearly, that these conservation partnerships are for conserving the Amazonian territories and not land grabs. In fact, why does Kailasa need land? Kailasa already has its sovereign land and multiple autonomous and semi-autonomous territories across the globe. We do not need land in some remote part of the Amazon. Kailasa has such beautiful sovereign territories and autonomous territories all across the globe, and not like you trying to grab and distort and trying to manipulate people. Rather, Kailasa goes and conserves. These agreements of conservation partnerships focus on environmental protection, cultural protection, and sustainable development with clear benefits for the indigenous communities. Of course, at least if you have seen the treaty, if you had even read the treaty, you would know the amount of cultural preservation that Kailasa mentions in the treaties and agreements that we have with the Bolivian indigenous nations. All the agreements include the explicit provision that the various grants, the various donations, the various leases will be effectuated only after ratification by the competent authorities. These clauses within the treaties and agreements that Kailasa has signed is in full compliance with the Bolivian law, with international law, and it is of no concern. Are you lawyers? Are you part of the United Nations? Do you represent the Bolivian constitution? You do not even know the amount of articles in the Bolivian constitution which are favorable to indigenous nations, which are already there in the treaties and agreements that Kailasa has signed. The Times Now frauds deliberately withhold this crucial information to create a false impression of illegality where none exists. We'll be back right after a short break. I request all the participants and viewers to stay tuned with us for exposing the more and more lies that Times Now is trying to prove and trying to propagate, trying to perpetuate. that 3 indigenous tribes were duped and conned into signing lease agreements with a non-existent country. This allegation is factually false and reveals your colonial mindset.
Let's look at the deliberate denial of the indigenous agency that is so-called perpetrated by the deep state media, the fraud media. The Times now is one of the world's most corrupt media that is there. Just exposing the Times Now the corruptions that is by Times Now in itself would have an entire set of videos playlist dedicated to this, because the deliberate attempts that you guys do to cause entire amount of problems around the world, trying to hide the actual issues and trying to pay whatever comes to you is so much that it is going to dedicate an entire playlist to you guys. But now let us look at the claims that you guys have, where you try to claim that the indigenous leaders were duped or conned, is literally and very intriguing, because what you are technically trying to do here is that you are trying to deny their intelligence. I would like to know, Times Now, what have you got to do with any of them? They are halfway across the world on the other side, whereas you, sitting in India, you have a lot of problems which are going on there. How is this even relevant? It's not relevant. The organization that signed with the indigenous nations of Bolivia is from the US, and the indigenous nations, by their authority, by the Bolivian constitution, have the rights for self-determination. So it is two different entities. They try to enter into different relationship. They enter into various agreements, which is then recognized and registered with the government of Bolivia. Now, how is this conning? How is this being duped? Over all of these, how does it matter to you?
Actually, many of you just know that only 3 indigenous nations signed, whereas we have multiple indigenous nations from across the globe. The United States of Kailasa is the founding member. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is the founding member of the United Nations, which is an intergovernmental body that has over 100 plus indigenous nations which are part of the United Nations intergovernmental body. And you just know about 3. Go search all around the world, from the Maori tribes of the New Zealand all the way to the Inuit tribes of Canada. Kailasa signed diplomatic relations and international agreements with multiple of the indigenous nations, and you only know 3. Go do your research and you will find that Kailasa has so many indigenous nations, because that is what we stand for. Kailasa stands for the rights of indigenous people and defending indigenous people against anti-indigenous racist media like all of you who are trying to perpetrate and trying to stop the humanitarian aid, stop the investments, stop the growth of the indigenous nations of Bolivia. This is not just an attack on Kailasa like you're trying to portray it to be. This is an attack on the indigenous nations of Bolivia, who are actually the benefactors of these agreements that we are signing with them.
When we are looking at so many problems that are happening right in your home country, where the things are happening, where there is so much of corruption, literally the tribes who are there in India are actually having so many issues, and they are still let down. They are still as slaves. Why that doesn't matter any difference to you? It doesn't make any difference to you. And you try to set as the narrative telling that Kailasa has duped. As we mentioned here, you have no idea absolutely. Just because you go around streaming, just because you don't have any content and you don't have any viewers who are coming and watching your channel, you try to perpetrate all of these anti-state media narratives that are there. You try to put in the anti-Hindu deep state mental setup and narratives so that you can try and dupe the other Hindus who are there. But then it is very, very obvious that what you are doing is just letting out hot steam, and that makes no difference at all. Because what you are doing is nothing but a very clear colonial mindset tactic that is there. You are a predator. You are a colonist predator. And that is why you're trying to infringe into the rights of the indigenous people who are there in Bolivia. Why does it matter to you? It does not. And where did Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism come into this entire picture? Did you even look at the agreement that was signed? Did you look at the cooperation that was signed? Do you even read the clauses which are there in it? Just blatantly having no clue, close your eyes, blind it, and say, just scream the shit out of your lungs. Makes no difference for anybody. People are not fools. The listeners are not stupid. Just because you get paid doesn't mean you scream whatever you want. And just because you scream whatever you want doesn't make it a truth. What you are portraying is nothing but a colonial mindset, where you are able to tag and you're able to label the indigenous leaders as those who are incapable of making their own informed decisions in their life, and that they are incapable about entering into their international relations. There's a limit to all of these atrocities, and people are not fools.
And let me also tell a very important point. While you claim that they were duped, all these negotiations, of course, you do not know the Bolivian constitution, nor you know the ILO convention and the various international law, which clearly says that indigenous people, whenever there's any relations with indigenous people, it has to have a free, prior, informed consent, which is given by the whole of community to enter into any relations, to enter into any agreement with them. And Kailasa, of course, has clearly legally studied all of these laws and have received the consent letters, have received the necessary consultation, the prior approval of the whole community, and having a unanimous support. Anywhere Kailasa goes, whether it is the indigenous people of Bolivia, whether it is any indigenous people, they are so welcoming, so full of gratitude, and having overwhelming support for Kailasa's treaties, for Kailasa's aid, for Kailasa's humanitarian support to come and support them. So unlike your ignorant knowledge, Kailasa has actually done all the required procedures, all the required legal and cultural procedures to refute people like you who are completely anti-indigenous. While Kailasa is pro-indigenous, Kailasa has taken into account every single member's consent. Every single member's, it is not just one such person, not like your authoritative countries where the deep state has one big leader and that big leader can do whatever he wants. Unlike that, the indigenous and the Kailasa has structured governance, has structured democracy, and has takes democracy very seriously. Unlike deep state authorities, Kailasa is actually pro-democracy, and Kailasa has abided by all of the indigenous rules, all of the procedures, their customary law, international law, and the law of the Constitution of the Plurinational State of Bolivia. So it is clearly well documented and all the procedures have been fulfilled, and we are here to show you all the documentation needed for showing you that all the free, prior, informed consent has been gotten from the communities, and it is in full unanimous consent of the indigenous communities that Kailasa has established diplomatic relations with all of them.
Friends, now I just want to let you guys know that you are just so furious, you're just so boiling that you are not able to put up and bear with the success of Kailasa, and that is the matter of fact over here. Because you have tried to take your same tactics, trying to just scream your lungs out, trying to just show outwards, fancy stuff, all that does not work. You go on to do that, your allegations die in a couple of days, Kailasa continues to stay strong. And we have everything with evidences, and what you are trying to cause here is just trying to exploit. And you need to know what you are exploiting over here. It is not just Kailasa that you are trying to attack. Please be clear, you are not attacking us, you are trying to attack, but bitterly and utterly failing with it. And it's very, very clear. So you have been trying to put in all your efforts, all your resources, getting all your hands on deck, where you're able to publish 6 different videos and articles in just a span of 24 hours. And that makes it really surprising for every one of us how interested you are and how you are so desperate to get views, because you know that Kailasa makes headlines every single time because of the contributions that we have done, because you don't even have the basic number of viewers who come and watch. So you try to desperately dig, twist and change the narrative and publish. Why don't you just go over and look at your videos? The number of people who have commented in your videos are way more positive, and those who actually support Kailasa and not what you are speaking. So even this is a tactic where you have utterly and bitterly failed, because your narratives stand no chance. And it's very clear, it's very, very clear to the entire world. You have just bitterly and utterly failed. And the thing is that you're so shameless times now, you're so shameless that whatever false narratives you've tried to spin, you've tried to publish in the last so many years with Kailasa and about Kailasa, you received legal notices. You have pulled down those same narratives, but you shamelessly try to take and use those very same narratives. Are you so desperately out of content? Are you so desperately out of any requirement that you are ready to step out of your own boundaries, whether legally, morally? Yeah, why are you going to care about any of that? Because you especially all the owners of Times Now, all the editors of Times Now, all the representatives of Times Now, I'd like to know if you were really born to your people, because that kind of brings in a real narrative about who you are. I don't think you're born to your, I guess every one of us understand, but you are born to the colonial racist and indigenous people who are ready to predate on any prey that is there. And I just want you to know, yes, Kailasa is the indigenous nation, but we are not going to back down. And we are not just going to protect ourselves, we are not just going to stand up for ourselves, we are going to defend the rights of every indigenous who are out there. You have run out of fodder in your own country that you're trying to go halfway around the globe and trying to attack the indigenous there just because you think they are prey. What is the requirement? What is the requirement? It just shows how down your TRP is, how low you have hit the ground, that you are having to go take content all the way across the world which has got no relevance with the Indian viewers or your so-called paid viewers who are there. But you go barge and prey and predate into the prey that is there all the way on the other side of the globe. Really shows what kind of pity situation that you are in. Fraud Times Now. You are in anti-media, anti-Hindu media Times Now, and shamelessly, openly, blatantly doing this.
And your own broadcast shows Kailasa representatives in dialogue with indigenous communities and trying to show as Kailasa is duping them. Don't you see them smiling in those pictures which you yourself have shown in your broadcast? Don't you see the long hours of negotiations, of talks, of friendly cultural exchange that is happening? You yourselves have never even looked in to the content that you're publishing. You have no idea whether it is on the Bolivian law, whether it is even the name of the indigenous nation that you are even posting the news about. You don't even know who they are, what they represent. And like Chandrashekara was saying, they are thousands of miles away from you, yet you prey on them. They are already marginalized indigenous minority communities, and instead of supporting them, instead of showing the good work, the light that Kailasa is doing to empower those communities, to stand up for the rights of indigenous people, rather you uglily take and show them in the bad light, you persecute them even more, marginalize them even more, and this shows how cheap you have become. This shows that you have no human quality left inside you. You have become a predator of innocent indigenous people who are living peacefully in the Amazon, signing treaties with those who care about them. Kailasa takes so much of effort in uniting the indigenous nations across the globe, and you have no idea of the amount of trust, the amount of cultural exchange, the amount of humanitarian work that Kailasa has done with them. Rather, you persecute them. And it is people like you, the colonist mindset people, anti-indigenous media, who are trying to prey on these indigenous people, who are trying to remove the rights of the indigenous people. This is not an attack on Kailasa, rather this is an attack on the indigenous people, an attack on their sovereignty, on their autonomy, on their rights that have been given to them, not just by the Bolivian constitution, but by the various international treaties that even Bolivia is a signatory of. And you liars deliberately edit and mistranslate these exchanges to try to create a false impression of conflict, whereas it was such a beautiful cultural exchange, it was such a beautiful uniting of indigenous people from across the globe.
I think Tattva Maharaj, here we are giving a little too much of credit to these, by calling them predators, because they are actually not predators. They don't even have the guts to go hunt down something. They are just scavengers, where when already things are exploited, try to get it over from there. You cowards, if you have the guts, then come on a live interview with us. We are already open to it. And we asked, you guys reached out to us asking for an interview, and when we agreed to it, you changed the terms. You did not even show your face. You brought in different things that were not even there, which was not agreed upon. You are not even ready for a live interview. If you are so cowardly that you can't even agree and you're not even able to come to a live interview with us, what kind of a person are you? Because you have only indulged in malpractice. All that you have done all this while is nothing but corruption. If we look at the word corruption and if we look at Times Now, there's no difference between both of these, because it's exactly the same. Because you can never run based on facts, based on evidences, based on what is truth. You don't even know anything. And you are so cowardly that you're not even ready for a live interview. I challenge you, if you have the guts, if any of the Indian media, you guys have the guts and you really want to know what happened, come on a live interview with us. We are ready. Reach out to contact@kailasa.org. Send out your request if you want to come on a live interview with us. Our representatives, we will come and we will answer every single question that you have, that you fraud media Times Now has. Be a man. Wake up and try to become a little man. You guys are such shameless creatures that you just hide behind and you guys try to go on exploiting the marginalized communities which are there. Don't you feel cheap about yourself? And this is where all the media, all the people who are there, who are watching your people, I guess like even among the subscribers or the viewers, that you get half of that is paid, and that is the reason you've run out of money, which is the reason you are having to scavenge from other countries, which has got nothing to do with anything of what's going on in your country. When the situation is like this, you just prey on top of those marginalized communities. So giving you the term predator in itself is an additional step to you. You guys are just scavengers, hyenas, where you are the deep state media which is working against the countries, which is working against the Hindus, and you know very well that you are losing legitimacy across the entire Hindu diaspora which is there, and that you are not able to do anything about it. Kailasa, on the other hand, is continuously receiving a lot of support. You can scream twice a day, thrice a day, and you will be forgotten in a blink of a finger. You are gone in a snap of a finger. That's it. You're forgotten. But Kailasa stands strong, and we have been evolving, and you're not able to put up with it. You're not able to stomach it. That's the reason you've been going all while in your attacks with no success at all. Go read your comments. It is all in success of Kailasa. So that very clearly shows that the number of viewers who are watching yours are themselves in support of Kailasa.
And all of you should know, the Times Now, especially the anti-Indo-racist media, that the cultural synergy between Kailasa and the various anti-indigenous media are so much alike. Whether it is the principles of ahimsa or the principles of the various Hindu principles, they are so similar to the cultural values of the indigenous communities in Bolivia. These shared values, for example, they call the mother nature as Pachamama, we call as Pachayamma. There is so much of cultural exchanges, cultural similarities between Kailasa and the indigenous nations. But of course, you have not even done your due diligence. You have not even done a little bit of homework to even understand these communities. I bet you cannot even pronounce the names of these communities by your mouth. These shared values include reverence to nature, to cosmic harmony, to spiritual connection to our own land, Bhuma Devi, the values that have united the ancient indigenous people across the world for millennia till now. Unlike you colonist media who are existing just for 10-20 years, we indigenous people have existed for thousands of years and will continue to exist for thousands of more years to show our support and solidarity to our indigenous brothers and sisters across the globe. Many communities practice even now the practices of the recognizing the divinity in Mother Nature, recognizing the divinity in one and each other, and they are so similar to our Hindu principles, to the principles of Kailasa. We are extensions of Hindu nations 5,000 years old and have connections, the spiritual connection to our indigenous brothers and sisters who are continuing to live for thousands of years now. Unlike all of you who are just waking up now and trying to shout few things in media, trying to see if you can oppress, trying to see if you can continue the colonist mindset. But I'm very sorry to say that Kailasa and the indigenous communities continue to hold our solidarity in spite of your media racist attacks, in spite of your anti-indigenous attacks, in spite of the persecution that you are committing to the indigenous people of Kailasa and Bolivia.
I'm sure the Times Now, you fraud fellows don't even understand these things. You goons, you thugs, you fraud people don't even understand these terms or these languages because you need to be born to your mother. But that doesn't happen because you're not even part of the earth. Mother in our tradition is earth. Earth is our mother. But that doesn't even come to any of you. You're not even born from there. So you are born for something else. And I don't know what that is. Because you do not understand any of these languages. You do not understand any of this. Because all that you are vested into, all that you only care about is misrepresentation, is sensationalization, is colonial mindset, is false promises, is false representations, is misappropriating, abusing, producing deep fakes, maligning, anything else. If we can actually bucket list the entire set of all the worst set of words that are there, we can find all of those in your channel where you've been trying to label everybody around you like that because you are not able to make a living out of making what is really true. And that is the fact, because you do not know any of these things. Being in the land, I'm not asking you to be a Hindu. No, I'm not asking you of that. But you are in a land where the Hinduism or the rights or the fundamental cores of Hindu values or the Indian values, rather, let me put it that way, is widespread. But you fellows don't care about any of that. And that kind of really brings us to who are you loyal to? Even a dog is much more loyal than you times no fraud who are there. You guys are such fraudsters that you go on to any extreme just to get views, just to get some name, just to try and get some TRP, which is just baseless. And it's really amusing that you are able to think that this is going to get you anything forward and that you're going to be able to sustain it any further. No. And that kind of becomes really evident when you are able to pick up topics that has got no relevance to you once again. Once again, I challenge you, if you are able to prove any of our statements wrong, come on a live interview with us. We are open to it. We are open to all the interviews that you are ready for, all the live interviews. Come on a live. You stream live, we stream live. Let's see. Let's face it one-on-one. Same way, for all the other genuine media houses who are there as well, we are more than ready to present our side facts, our side representations with the evidences as to what actually transpired there, how Kailasa has established these relationships with these indigenous people, and how we have been supporting them continuously. What we are looking at here is not something that was started yesterday and day before. Come on, Kailasa has been there in Latin America since 2004. Please understand, it's a 21-year-old history in Latin America. When the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism went to Latin America personally and started. So the relationship that Kailasa carries with these indigenous communities was something that's just stemmed yesterday or day before, like you fools try to blabber and that you fools try to shout around. You know what? That just makes you as jokers and clowns to the entire world, because you are such a paid audience. Please understand, you not just get money from the people who are trying to post their content on you, but you also you pay the money to the audience who need to watch your views. That's exactly what you do, otherwise you get no views. And that's very clearly referred in the number of videos that you publish, because only fictitious content sells to your audience. And those kind of audience are those which are purchased by you. So why do you guys bother about any of these things? Because you do not have the guts to face the truth. You do not have the guts to speak the fact. You do not have the guts to present the evidences. All that you can do is just try and run a smear campaign on anybody and everybody and try to see is there anything that gets caught. That's it. You are as worthless and as useless as any other stone on the street. That's basically who you guys are. If you are really interested, times now, if you are really even worth a speck of dust on the street, I challenge you for a live interview with us. You stream it live, we stream it live. Ask your questions, we will present it with the facts. Let's see. But you are covered and you cannot face us. That's the fact, and that's what exactly transpired yesterday when you allegedly reached out to us asking for a live interview, and when we came for the live interview, you fled from the scene, not wanting to sit by the agreements. Now, who is the coward here? You guys. Once again, I challenge you. Come over for the interview. And even for all the other news channels who are there, whether you are in India or whether you're a global media outlet who is there, if you guys really want to know the truth, we are ready. Representatives of Kailasa are ready for a live interview. Head over to contact@kailasa.org. Post your questions. Send your request for a live interview. We are more than happy to schedule one with you. Present all the facts. We are here serving the community. we are here serving the world. We are here making the world a better place to live. Unlike you people who try to continuously destroy the indigenous communities, who try to destroy the planet Earth. What do you guys know about the indigenous? If today you are alive having food on your plate, it is because the Amazon forest out there is still surviving. And the indigenous are the survivors and they are the protectors. They are the defenders of this Amazon forest which are there. But because you go on antagonizing them, you go on marginalizing them, you go on attacking them, threatening them, what you are causing is a full stop for your own life and the entire world. These are all the repercussions which you're not really going to care about any of these things, because what really matters to you is what is there in front of your plate. If not, it doesn't exist for you, right?
So stay tuned, we'll be right back with you after a short break, and we have more and more lies and completely false defamation and the perpetration of lies given by Times Now. We'll be right back with you after a short break. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. was saying that Kailasa attempts to lease 3,900 square kilometers of land for thousands of years. This characterization fundamentally misrepresents the nature of our agreements. Our agreements is not trying to grab land or some weird the con that you are trying to misrepresent our agreements. Rather, it is a partnership of conservation, partnership of protection of the Amazonian lands. And as we are indigenous nations, our indigenous nations have existed for thousands of years and going to exist for thousands of years, and that is why Kailasa has these agreements for forever, for our time, because we know that not like you, our media house is going to be shut down in a few days, months or years, but our indigenous nation is going to stand for thousands of years and has already stood for thousands of years in spite of your racist attacks, in spite of the persecution that you and your anti-indigenous racist media that commit on Kailasa.
In fact, over here, I just wanted to make a really beautiful comment over here, because one of the videos that you fools had published, you had actually put in the title that Kailasa purchased or scammed about 4,000 square feet of land. You don't even have the guts, you don't even have the brain to even scam properly. You know, that is what you give to the audience, and go look at the comments in that video. People are asking if really that is the fact. If Kailasa actually got about 4,000 square feet, it is actually Kailasa which got scammed. You, even when twisting the facts, and even when twisting and presenting the facts are not even accurate in there. The actual fact, even as what you're looking at to say that okay, it was 3,900 square kilometers, is still less. I want you guys to understand, Kailasa has multiple sovereign territories. What you are trying to do is trying to dispute just one of the multiple agreements that Kailasa has signed with the indigenous communities which are there. As Sattva Maharaj had shared earlier, we have signed not hundreds, thousands, and not just in South America, across all the continents on planet Earth. Name it, we have it. We have been working tirelessly. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has been working tirelessly day and night to really support at the very grassroots level, reaching out to the indigenous community, reaching out to every one of them, supporting them, giving them the physical health, the mental health, the psychological health, providing them with food, providing them with shelter, providing them with clothes, providing them with education, with healthcare. All of this is being done to all of these indigenous people all across the planet Earth. And what you are trying to do is just trying to dispute. I wouldn't even give you the credit that you have disputed. You have just been trying to dispute one agreement. Just one. And that also you bitterly failed, because though you try to go on screaming that they have rescinded from us, the fact is that they still continue to be with Kailasa. The fact is that we still hold very good relationship with them. The fact is that we continue to support them, we continue to enrich them, even during this lawfare that you, anti-indigenous media, that you racist media, that you fraud thugs and goons are trying to perpetrate against the vulnerable indigenous community. Kailasa is standing, defending each and every one of them. We are working with them and we will continue to work with them, and you can do nothing about it. You can do absolutely nothing about it, because your videos are going to die down in the next 2 days, but Kailasa is going to stay strong for the next few centuries and centuries to come by, because what Kailasa has been today, what the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has established today, is not just one nation. We have the United Ancient Nations, which is the governing body, which is an intergovernmental organization, which has multiple of these ancient nations, multiple of these First Nations, multiple of these indigenous nations that are a part of it, that are members of it, that are officials of it. What does that mean? That means our legacy is going to stand long after you're gone. We are going to stay long after you're gone, and you can do nothing about it. And this kind of burns you, that you are not able to do anything. That even when the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism was there in India, you couldn't do anything about it. Now, after Kailasa has been established, you cannot do anything about him. Even after Kailasa has been established, even after the intergovernmental organization has been established, you cannot do anything about it. The fact is that you are vulnerable. You are desperate that the amount of money that you have poured into trying and creating the atrocity material, the abuse material about Kailasa and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has all gone into vain with no return on investment, because all of those is such fraud, and now you are not able to sustain yourself. So you are going all out desperate in a very, very, very blatant way, which is very explicitly clear that you have failed. You fraud, anti-indigenous, deep state media, anti-Hindu deep state media times now has failed bitterly and utterly.
If you had even given some attention and paid some awareness to the agreements that were signed between Kailasa and the indigenous nations, you will clearly see that these agreements contain specific clauses from the constitution of the plurinational state of Bolivia and the international law that clearly respect the rights of indigenous nations and including the land of the indigenous nations. Unlike you, who have no respect, who have no compassion for the indigenous nation, actually the constitution of Bolivia does recognize the sovereignty, the autonomy and the safety of these lands which are owned by the indigenous nations. The constitution clearly states that the integrity of indigenous territory is recognized, which includes the right to maintain and develop their own forms of economic, cultural and spiritual life, and all resources provided by these partnerships are managed by the communities themselves through their traditional government systems. And unlike you, the Bolivian constitution actually cares about these indigenous people, and the constitution of Bolivia has clearly stated rights in support of the indigenous people, who clearly give the rights and give the self-determination, unlike you who are trying to take away the self-determination of the indigenous people. This attack that you are doing is not an attack on Kailasa, rather it is an attack on the indigenous people, trying to instigate the deep state which is behind you. The people who are behind, the editors, the so-called narrative that you're trying to push is trying to actually take away the self-determination of these indigenous communities. And we are here to stand and defend our indigenous brothers and sisters, and even today we stand in solidarity. Like Chandrashekara told, if you go ask any of the indigenous people today that who have signed with Kailasa, the relationship between Kailasa and them stays for perpetuity, because we are not bothered, we do not care, we do not bother about the lies, the anti-hate propaganda, the anti-indigenous propaganda that you're trying to perpetuate in the global media. And you should know that you have utterly failed. This is a failed attempt, and such a disgusting attempt to undermine the sovereignty, to undermine the self-determination, to undermine the autonomy of the indigenous people of the Amazon people of Bolivia.
Actually, times now, all your editors, all your the chiefs and whoever else is there, it really makes me wonder whether you guys, what kind of specimens you guys are, what kind of creatures you guys are. Do you guys even have literates who are part of your company? Those who actually know to read and write stuff? Or you just pick them from the road by throwing the money on their face? Looks like all your fellows who are there are just such cheap fellows, I wouldn't even give the title of humans. You guys are such specimens, such creatures that you have no basic values about life. I don't know what you guys get taught in your schools. Or do you just come here to spread all these false propaganda? Because all that you seem to be is that your entire bunch of editors, entire bunch of anchors who are there are picked up right from the slums of India, just picked up like those who will be fighting the cherry places. Just pick them up and come and put them on your panel and have them speak. Go and look at every one of your live stream, and exactly it is that's how it is. You have no basis of anything that you speak, because all that you guys do is just go around screaming recklessly, create a havoc and try to see if that fetches you any kind of attention. How long are you guys gonna be living like this? Don't you feel cheap about your own existence? There's a way to live. Man up, man. You guys are such cowards that you're not ready to face the truth, that you're not ready. You feel that if you actually present the truth, you will lose audience. And that's the kind of people who you guys are feeding. And they are exactly like you, and they care a shit about what you guys do. And that's the reason you are failing. Because the entire bunch of times now editors, or the entire bunch of times now the managers and everyone who is in your group just look like all illiterates who don't know to read English, who don't know to actually just go and Google up, who don't know to use AI, especially in this world, in this time when there's so much of AI that is there. Even if you just go and do a little Google and try and understand about the sovereignty and the rights that are vested in the indigenous, I'm sure that you will find evidences that are directly in relationship with what Kailasa has signed. In fact, what has been signed is not even with Kailasa. What has been signed is with a United States organization. An organization from the US has signed with the indigenous communities in the Bolivian nation. So when we look at this, even if you have a little bit of brain and if you are little literate people, it would be very clear that you are actually doing a little bit of research. But what you do, just blatantly come and scream, just shows that you are all a bunch of illiterate fools who are trying to reach out to people, who are just trying to throw things around. It is just so evident that you guys are just fools with no knowledge of what is there. It's not that you don't care, it is that you guys are just what it is. I really wonder, do you guys eat food for your food or do you guys eat something else for it? Because even if you have little values in your life, you will do the basic fact checking. Not just that you have violated any and every code of ethics that are there in journalism, you guys seem to just discourage it just like it. You have no values for anything, you guys don't care about anything, and you guys are just such cheap fraud media that you only live out of scavenging and exploiting the vulnerable communities which are there.
Have you times now even seen the agreements of that Kailasa has signed? Have you even read the agreements that Kailasa has signed? You claim that Kailasa has given money for these indigenous lands and territories. You should understand that these are not just payments for land, but are investments to our indigenous brothers and sisters for developing, for preserving their ancient Amazonian rainforest lands, their environment protection, and for preservation of their culture. For actually, somebody unlike you, Kailasa actually works for the betterment of communities. Kailasa actually works to provide the humanitarian services, and they themselves exercising their self-determination, exercising the autonomous rights given to them, they come to Kailasa and they determine the value of these agreements. They tell us how much they need, they tell us the areas of cooperation, whether it's in food, whether it's in education, and based on that, Kailasa brings investments, Kailasa brings in the people, the resources to flourish these communities. Unlike you, Kailasa actually does the groundwork to understand their needs. Kailasa goes and does the groundwork to bring, to empower them, to enrich them. Unlike you, who just sit on a screen and keep shouting and trying to undermine the sovereignty and autonomy and persecute these communities more and more than they're already suffering so much. You, colonial mafia, are fixated on just the monetary aspect, because for you, it is only money that matters to you. Rather, for Kailasa and even for the indigenous communities, it is the services, it is the preservation of their culture, it is the protection of their lands, it is the cultural reciprocity that they look at, that they work towards, and that they see is a win-win-win to have relationship with Kailasa.
You guys are such colonial mafia. Exactly, that was a beautiful word that Tattva Maharaj had used. You guys are actually colonial mafia, because what the colonizers had tried to do and did earlier to those indigenous communities out there was just terrible. And all of this is covered in the UN reports, where how they were forced and subjected to torture, and that's exactly what you guys are doing, where you continue to put them into a state of delusion, trying to put them into a state of captivation, using your false narratives about them, trying to just threaten them. All the colonial mafia gang of times now, you guys are just working in such a way so that you can try and keep these indigenous communities, indigenous nations under control. But you need to know, there are much bigger entities than you. There are much powerful entities than you, who very clearly see and who very clearly describe the atrocities that are committed by you, the false narratives that are peddled and meddled by you. It is under watch and you are all labeled. Why don't you go and look at your ranking score in the World Media Index? you stand at one of the last places, if not the last. That shows how corrupt you Times Now media is, because this is what you guys have been doing, trying to gain a living, and have desperately lost. You have desperately lost, because not just information is in the fingertips of people through social media, but now expertise is in the fingertips of people through AI. Because AI is very clear. Anybody wants to fact check anything, just go over to AI. Go to Grok, go to ChatGPT, go to Claude. You have so many AI bots which are there, chatbots which are there. Go over, verify the information, and you will get the facts straight on your face. So because the AI is threatening your entire industry, where you have been trying to peddle just false narratives and false agendas, colonial agendas, that is the reason today you are struggling. You are trying to do everything desperately which is there in your capacity to try and get a few plates of money in your hands so you can survive. But be very clear, your end is soon, because you're never going to be able to survive in this trajectory by just spreading false narratives, because AI has taken over your entire industry, and AI speaks the facts, not your opinions. All that you try to do is spread false opinions. Times Now fraud people, all your fraud gangs, just live off other people's ignorance, live off other people's negativity, try and exploit people's ignorance, and that is what you guys have been doing, which has been trying and feeding you. But now no more ignorance is the food for you, because AI is out. People are going to go to AI, so you are going to be out of your industry, and you're just trying your best shot at surviving. Good luck to you.